welcome to the deep dive.
Yeah.
We're doing something a little different today. We're going deep into the predictions of Lee Kuan Yew,
Yeah.
the former Prime Minister of Singapore,
Yep.
and a guy whose views, really, people around the world paid attention to.
Right.
And we're looking at his book, One Man's View of the World, which came out in 2013.
2013.
So it's been over a decade
Over a decade, yeah.
since these predictions were made.
It's like a time capsule.
It really is, yeah.
Yeah.
It's like a time capsule of, like, what did this guy who's, respected around the world, what did he think was going to happen?
Yeah, he saw the world with remarkable clarity. I mean, obviously anybody's view of the future
Sure.
has limitations.
Right.
But he was a very, very sharp observer.
Yeah.
Very insightful.
Absolutely. And so we're going to look at what he said about China, U.S., Europe, Japan, India, really the whole world.
The whole world, yeah. He made some bold pronouncements.
He did.
And I think we'll see that some of them have held up remarkably well and some of them maybe not so much.
Right. So let's dive in.
Let's do it.
So Lee Kuan Yew, he had some interesting and perhaps, I think, for some unexpected views on China.
Right.
Did he think that China was on a path to become a democracy like we see in the West? Not really.
No, at all. In fact, he argued that China's long history, thousands of years of centralized power,
Right.
shaped their approach to governance. He saw their strong center as absolutely crucial
Yeah.
for maintaining peace and prosperity for such a massive and diverse population.
And he pointed to the Wukong incident.
Right.
You might remember that was back in 2011.
Right.
These villagers were protesting against corrupt local officials, and it got a lot of international attention.
It did.
But the interesting thing is, and what Lee Kuan Yew pointed out, was that even in challenging local authorities, the people, they still maintain loyalty to that central authority.
Right, which is an important distinction to make, right? I mean, there are definitely elements of dissent within China,
Sure.
but there's also this deep-seated belief in a unified, strong China.
Right. And a belief that, this is part of how things work.
Right.
Like there's a way to do this where we don't, descend into chaos.
Exactly. Exactly.
So considering this strong center, what did Lee Kuan Yew predict about China's role on the world stage?
He believed that China's rise was inevitable, that it would happen peacefully for the most part, but it would force other countries, especially in the Asia-Pacific region, to adjust to this new reality.
And he pointed to something that actually happened not even in the future, but in the past. 2008. Do you remember when China pressured ExxonMobil, which is this major U.S. oil company,
Yeah.
to stop drilling in the South China Sea?
Right, after Vietnam had granted them the rights.
Yeah. So what was that about?
Well, it was a clear signal that China was willing to assert its interests even before reaching its full economic and military potential.
And it was a signal to not just to the U.S., but to everyone in the region.
Everybody, yeah.
Like, hey, this is, we're here. You need to keep this in mind.
And we're not afraid to, use whatever leverage we have.
Yeah. So he saw this powerful China emerging.
Yeah.
And he made a pretty bold prediction about the balance of power between China and the U.S.
Yeah, he believed that within a generation, the power equation between China and the U.S. would equalize.
So that would be within 20 to 30 years
Within 20 to 30 years, yeah.
of when he said this.
And he said, this would require every country in the region
Right.
to carefully navigate their relationships with these two superpowers.
And he had some very specific thoughts about Taiwan.
Yes, Taiwan was a point of particular concern.
It's a flashpoint, really, in that whole region.
It is. It is. He believed that the stakes were incredibly high for China regarding Taiwan's status.
Yeah.
And he predicted that the U.S. wouldn't risk a major military conflict with China over it.
Essentially, it's not worth it to get into a prolonged conflict with China.
Right.
Especially one that they're willing to fight and keep fighting to win.
Absolutely. It was a sobering assessment that really raised questions about the future of Taiwan and the delicate balance of power in the region.
Right. So China's rise was a key theme in Lee Kuan Yew's view of the world. But what about the U.S.?
Yeah.
Did he see America's global influence fading in light of China's rise?
Well, not necessarily. He had immense respect for the dynamism of the American economy and its ability to innovate.
He was a big fan of the iPhone, the iPad, Microsoft, the internet.
Yeah, all these groundbreaking innovations that came from America.
He really was impressed with that kind of ingenuity.
Absolutely. He saw these as hallmarks of a society that was constantly pushing boundaries, driven to create the next big thing.
But it wasn't just about technology. He also highlighted how vital immigration has been to America's success.
Right. The ability to attract bright minds from all over the globe. And he really felt that was a major factor in America's economic and cultural vibrancy.
Yeah, it's interesting how something like language can play such a big role in shaping a country's future.
Well, he even contrasted it with China, where he felt that the difficulty of learning the Chinese language posed a barrier to attracting global talent.
Right.
So that was a real asset that the U.S. had.
Right. So he saw a lot of strengths in America, but were there any areas where he saw weaknesses?
Oh, absolutely. He was very concerned about the state of education in the U.S., particularly in elementary and high schools.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like if you don't have a good foundation, it doesn't matter how fancy your universities are.
Right. He argued that if America couldn't nurture talent from a young age, it would ultimately harm its long-term competitiveness.
And so that's a question for you listening. Do you think can the U.S. maintain its global standing if its foundation, if its education system is shaky?
Yeah, it's a real concern. He also pointed to other issues like infrastructure, the class divide, racial discrimination, the influence of money in politics. He felt these were serious challenges that America needed to address.
He did.
But at the same time, he also noted that Americans have a tendency to exaggerate their problems.
They do. They love drama.
They do. It makes for good news, right?
It does.
So, a mixed bag for the U.S., according to Lee Kuan Yew. Immense strengths, but also some potentially crippling weaknesses.
Right.
So we've been exploring Lee Kuan Yew's predictions about the future of these different countries. And now we get to kind of a region that has been just like a focal point of global Mars for decades, the Middle East.
Okay. This is where things get really interesting. Lee Kuan Yew, he did not shy away from offering his kind of very blunt assessments of the Middle East. And he had some particularly interesting views on the Arab Spring uprisings, which were sweeping through the region when he was writing this back in 2013.
Yeah, and I mean, you have to remember, this was right in the thick of it. I mean, the Arab Spring was still unfolding, and a lot of people were optimistic, that this was going to lead to, like, a wave of democratization.
Right, a new era.
A new era, exactly. But Lee Kuan Yew, he wasn't so sure. He wasn't convinced that democracy would, like, easily take root in a lot of these Arab countries. He saw the kind of tribal or feudal systems that existed in parts of the Middle East as being a major obstacle to developing like really strong democratic institutions.
And he drew a contrast between how power is structured in the West, where it's like, the individual citizen is kind of the foundation, and in many Arab states where tribal allegiances often overshadow like national identity.
Right. So it's like, where does your loyalty lie? Is it to your tribe or to your country? And in a lot of these places, he argued, it was still very much with the tribe.
Right. It's a totally different way of thinking about power.
Absolutely. He used the example of Saudi Arabia, where he described a system where tribal leaders still brought gifts to the king, much like in, ancient China.
It's like a throwback to a different era.
Exactly. And he argued that in these systems, loyalty is often tied to the person, to the leader, not necessarily to the nation as a whole. So it makes it very difficult to build those kinds of democratic institutions where you have that sense of like shared citizenship.
Right. So it's almost like we're working from two different sets of rules here,
Yeah.
Like we're assuming that things work one way, but in other parts of the world, it's totally different.
Exactly. Exactly.
So did he see any hope for democratic progress in any of these Arab states? Like, were there any places where he thought, okay, maybe this could actually work?
He did acknowledge that some Arab states like Egypt, Morocco, Tunisia had made some progress in developing a more modern sense of national identity. But even in those cases, he felt that there was this one critical ingredient missing for democracy to truly flourish, and that was the ability to create real economic progress.
Right. It's like you can have the institutions in place, but if people are struggling to make ends meet, democracy is going to be pretty fragile.
Right. And he tied this directly to the treatment of women in a lot of these Arab societies. He was very critical of the lack of opportunities for women in education and employment, arguing that this was holding these countries back from reaching their full economic potential.
So he saw a link between women's empowerment and economic development.
Absolutely. He saw it as a cycle. Less educated women tend to raise less educated children and so on. And so he believed that having a generation of well-educated mothers was absolutely crucial for kind of nurturing young people with the skills and the mindsets that you need for for economic progress.
It's a pretty compelling argument, and one that I think, has gained increasing traction in development circles in recent years.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's something that he saw very clearly. He was very passionate about this issue. He even shared insights from his own travels to countries like Egypt, Saudi Arabia, where he had witnessed their social structures, their political dynamics firsthand.
Right. He was drawing on his own personal experiences and observations.
Right. And he even mentioned a conversation with an American diplomat who had served in Saudi Arabia, who described it as essentially a feudal setup.
Wow.
Yeah. So it's quite striking. So, he was definitely concerned about the prospects for democracy in the Middle East, but did he see any signs of positive change happening?
Yeah. Were there any glimmers of hope?
Well, he did point to some interesting developments. For example, he talked about the establishment of the King Abdullah University of Science and Technology, KULST, in Saudi Arabia.
Okay, so this was like a new university with a more kind of modern approach.
Right. He saw this university with its emphasis on science and technology and also its more liberal policies as a potential model for change. Could this be a place where you start to see a shift in thinking, a more open approach to education and society?
Right, like a beacon of progress, maybe.
Yeah, potentially. But it sounds like he was still cautious about, how quickly and in what direction that change might go.
Yeah.
He saw the region grappling with the challenge of providing sustainable growth and good jobs for this rapidly growing population. And he believed that their heavy reliance on energy resources would eventually force them to diversify their economies if they wanted to remain competitive globally.
So a somewhat cautious outlook for the Middle East, at least in terms of its ability to kind of fully embrace democratic reforms and make that transition to more diversified